Hello. This video is going to be a book review, or at least a discussion on this book, James Madison, America's First Politician by Jay Cost. And it was actually published, I think, last November. So it's relatively recent compared to most of the books I've been reading lately, even though the subject matter is quite old. Um, I'll just preface the talk about the book saying that the reason why I picked this particular book is because uh, when I was living in Chicago before I moved to England, I thought, oh, it'd be a good idea just to read biographies on the American president. Obviously, the 45th president right now, although it doubled up. There have actually been 44 people who have been president. Um, So got a little ways to go, but this is number 4 here. James Madison, who was part of the whole founding fathers bunch of people. He was quite young at the time of the Revolution, I think in his 20s, and he um, essentially sort of rubbed elbows with some really big players like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and he learned a lot from them. So just to now we'll just move into the book. Is that it's as a general opinion, it is interesting as a history book of the history of America and the history of his way of thinking, of Madison's thinking, um, but it does lack a lot in Madison's personal life. I'm thinking particularly about his relationship with his wife. You think would be a very big player in his life. My wife is in mine, but they kind of, I won't say skip over. That's not fair to the author, but it does kind of leave you lacking. And since a lot of these early founding father politicians were often working in concert with each other, it would be a little bit more helpful than just focus on his relationship with 3 particular people. And this was George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and James Monroe, who all 3 of those were from Virginia. All 3 of them were uh, landed people. All 3 of them, well, including Madison, they all had plantations. They all ended up being president, and they were all from Virginia. Um, so along with those plantations is they had slaves. Um, but so it's interesting to see those, but you don't really get a sense of what his relationship was. Maybe a little bit with Alexander Hamilton. I felt it was lacking that like his relationship with his family wasn't really gone into other than very cursory discussion of his early life. But I don't even remember very much about him talking about his mother. So it's interesting if you like the history of America, then you're in luck because there's a lot of discussion about the Constitution, the early Republic, and it lays out a lot of Madison's arguments, or at least his sort of inner workings of his mind of what he thought government was, and the pitfalls of certain aspects of the early Republic under the Articles of Confederation. Now, to say that you kind of have to sort of think about who Madison was. He was there was a big rift, if you want to call it, or like a political divide between Republicans who tended to be more of the countryside, tended to be from the mid-Atlantic down to the south. They tended to be farmers, or at least sort of represented mostly by farmers. Or these people represented farmers, we should say. So, and then the other side, you'd have the more like merchant type people who are from the north, like maybe New York or New England. Um, and these tensions kind of, while they were small at first, they started boiling up and boiling over in um, in the early republic. In the matter of ratifying the Constitution, even hammering out the details of the Constitution, and then getting them ratified in the state legislatures, and then trying to sell them to everyone, which was a pretty big ask. And so, that you kind of go through. So Madison tries to be a big salesman for the Constitution. Um, and like a lot of people in the country, he felt um, uh, that politics were getting in the way of banding the country together, because it wasn't clear that the British would be gone forever. And it actually ended up being true that the British were not looking to just take this one on the chin. They were looking for revenge. Who knows? It never really clearly stated what the British expected to come from a second round from the revolution. But it is clear that they did not really just respect them outright. And one of the other things you get in the foundation, so he was actually really just kind of came into his own after the revolution. He was really quite young, got overshadowed by people like George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, all the first three presidents. And he really got a lot of respect after the revolution, after the Articles of Confederation had been sort of enacted, and then everything started falling apart in the country. And he said, well, we've really got to do something. And a lot of what that's something that he wanted to do, he actually picked up from reading the classics. People like Xenophon and Plato and Aristotle, reading Roman history by Livy, and Tacitus. You start, once you read these, you see the pitfalls of things like, like if you read Plato, you see a lot of the pitfalls of democracy. If you read things like Polybius, who was a Greek historian of Rome. So he basically went to Rome, started looking around and say, hey, these Romans aren't as stupid as we Greeks think they are, that they have a lot of institutions that kind of keep things in check with one another. And so he learned that the reason why the America under the Articles of Confederation was falling apart because of factions. The central government didn't really have any control over what was going on, and essentially you could just pretty much do whatever you wanted. The states could pretty much do whatever they wanted to do. The central government had no power to tax. They really didn't. Any treaty that they signed could be ignored by the states, and the British and the French were just exploiting weaknesses. If you have a high tax and say the South, high import tariffs, they would just go to the North, and then they would just find a workaround. There was no united front on foreign policy, or there was no real no proper adjudication between problems between states, and there were lots of those. And so he thought essentially the sheer size of America and the different factions, regional factions, would actually kind of work as to kind of cause a lot of problems to go away, because nobody would ever actually get a majority, and so everything that kind of didn't get canceled out was thought as good. Now we see the results of this today, that essentially that you might be living in the same area as somebody and have a completely different mentality to them. You might agree with somebody who lives thousands of miles away. I think that his mentality doesn't really hold up, because we have a way of communicating with people for thousands of miles away, and having that ability to share things in common with people very far away, kind of be at odds with your neighbor. I think that's a unique situation that people will have with their as far as like agreeing in politics. But and so one of the interesting things that I'll just kind of point out, interesting nuggets that I took from this, is that when we think about American history and sort of like foundational ideas from it, John Locke often gets quoted as sort of like the end all be all of the American Revolution. That is basically everybody had read these, John Locke's treatise on government, and they basically just put it into action. Many years after he had written it. The thing is that John Locke actually wasn't the focus of a lot of the Virginia landowners. There was a guy named James Harrington who was, and he basically said that you essentially weren't really free unless you were completely independent. So independence was basically the goal. I mean, not just like independence from Britain, but independence, like you do not rely on anybody else. You're completely self-sufficient. In economics terms, you would call that autarky, or at a personal level, you might call it subsistence, getting by essentially. And Harrington, like the idea behind Harrington, actually went a little bit further and said that if you actually have to work the fields yourself, you're not completely independent. You need basically slaves to work your plantation, and you just put up your feet, read some books, and then you're free. And that's kind of runs counter to the idea of what we think of in America as sort of like just there's a mesh there that John Locke would talk about how land that wasn't being used for productive farming or productive use like mining or for like logging or anything like that was not really owned by anybody and couldn't because it wasn't being used. And so that if you put the land to work, you were essentially giving it a meaning, and you were giving yourself a meaning. And so that was the goal, is actually just to work. And anybody who interfered with that was essentially making you less independent. Your independence was basically following market forces. Now, Locke never mentions that, but essentially, if you read a lot of economics coupled with Locke, you'll see that essentially you are responding to a market. So you don't cut trees down unless people want trees, or you yourself need them. So it's interesting to see that that mentality didn't really exist in Virginia. And Virginia was probably one of the most populous states. There are a lot of people who historically were very, I wouldn't call them pro-English, but they were very English. They had an English, they basically were not what you would call dissenters, which means that they were Church of England people. Like as far as religion was concerned, they're very in line with England. They thought of themselves more as landed gentry in the same way that you would see in places like Yorkshire, the Midlands, in England. And a lot of people, especially people who made built plantations in the Caribbean, would take all that money and go buy land in England and essentially create their own sort of landed estate, even though they might not have had the position in the House of Lords. Another interesting thing is that I kind of, if you read a book, you kind of like bomb onto certain things. So if you know a little bit of the history of the United States, and particularly John Adams in his presidency, George Washington was the first president, and he served 2 terms as president. And he essentially served it because everybody convinced him that nobody else could do the job because nobody else had the credibility. And they needed credibility for people to trust the government. And he had the highest level of credibility. Even to this day, he is sort of like Moses. Or I can't think of anybody that sort of legendary, quite literally legendary, where a lot of stories are told about him that probably aren't true. And basically, hardly a bad word is ever said about him. And if you read a biography about him, he was quite a young. When he was young, he was a little bit angry or sullen, and he just mellowed out. And sometimes farm work will do that for you. Hard labor will do that to you. But it was interesting. So John Adams came in afterwards when George Washington had enough. He retired to his farm, and John Adams came in and totally just made an absolute mess of everything. So of the Federalist Party, which represented Northern interests, especially merchant interests, um, and usually the two main people would be, I would say three: John Jay, um, Alexander Hamilton, and John Adams. And they essentially pretty much declared war on anybody who didn't think exactly like them. And so they passed this Sedition Act. It essentially said, they basically went insane, threatened prison for anybody who disagreed with the president and his federal administration. And Madison and Jefferson didn't know how to react to this because this is clearly not what they were going for with the Constitution. It was a clear violation of, I mean, basically, you name an amendment at that point they weren't violating. And Jefferson and Madison didn't know what to do. The thing is, you couldn't fight it in the courts because all the judges were actually put into office by the Federalists. So they were in total agreement with this stuff because they were just following the law, not the spirit of the Constitution. So anyway, Jefferson and Madison kind of convinced, particularly newspaper writers, to um, just stay the course. If you get shut down, we'll open up another one. We will get the Republican message out. Smaller government, not super strong central power, and basically not just listening to what very rich merchants in the North have to say. And they basically said, we'll just stay the course. Don't take the bait. This whole thing is them taking a bait, because if you take the bait and you just overreact and you get violent, you're actually just proving the Federalist point by just being violent. Say, look, these people need to be put down because they're just causing a riot here and there. This kind of underlies the point that John Adams, though he was a founding father, if you read his biography, he seemed like a pretty good guy, but once he got in the White House, he just went psychopathic. Perhaps he was slightly beholden to the party factions that George Washington had warned everybody about. But he's easily, so far, the four presidents I've read about, and then I know about it, he's easily probably one of the worst presidents in the history of America. And so anybody who went before him, after him, looks great. So George Washington, what more needs to be said about him? But Thomas Jefferson, who often violated his own principles, came down looking pretty good compared to next to Adams. And then Madison comes in, and he looks pretty good compared to Adams. And but it's easy to look good when you go against somebody that bad. So one of the other things that, I'll try to keep this as short as possible. But one of the other things that we talk about Madison's presidency. So he basically started. He basically wrote a lot of the Constitution. He basically sold the Constitution through a series of letters and essays that they were published under the title of the Federalists. I recommend any American, if you want to understand the Constitution, or a foreigner who wants to understand the Constitution, sort of the work behind it. Basically, like, if you want to see what the American algorithm is, read them. They go into great explanation because they were trying to sell this idea to the state legislatures to pass it so that they could unite under this Constitution. When he becomes president, he violates a lot of this. He sees a lot of the value in federalism. He just calls it republicanism. So he has this sort of weird blend. When in the House, this kind of outlines the whole difference between various roles that he played in his life. As a writer of the Constitution, he was a political theorist, and as the subtitle of this book, America's First Politician, he was the first American political theorist. He wrote the Constitution. He showed his work behind it. He gave a lot of speeches in places that were kind of reluctant to passed the Constitution and really gave the whole constitutional project a lot of credibility, and so people eventually signed up for it. And then he basically becomes he goes right into the House of Representatives, and he becomes a Republican uh, stalwart, I would call it. Not maybe not an ideologue, but essentially he was the embodiment in the House of Representatives in the early the first Congress session of Congress, the first throughout all of the 1880s and 90s. He becomes sort of the voice of republicanism in America. And then under Jefferson, he becomes the Secretary of State, and he essentially starts dealing with a lot of the problems that John Adams had created with the French. The British were always a bit reluctant to accept America as an independent country. So much so that over the course of that it was John Adams who actually set up the Louisiana Purchase, which the British saw as just some sort of basically making them a rival, because it essentially doubled the size of the United States under Jefferson's presidency. But it also made the British pretty nervous, because basically America laid claim to most of the continent of the United States, and they were looking to expand in places that weren't explicitly settled by the British or the Spanish. And the British, throughout the whole post-revolution era, were always spoiling for a fight. We're always reluctant or two-faced about their negotiations with the Americans to establish some sort of peace. And a lot of that was due to the fact that they had been fighting they've been fighting the French during the Napoleonic Wars under the tail end of Jefferson and the beginning end of Madison. They were fighting Napoleon in Europe, and essentially, if you look at the Napoleonic Wars, Britain basically controlled the seas all over Europe, and Napoleon controlled the whole continent. It was army versus navy in the Napoleonic Wars. And so the British would say to the Americans, look, if we catch you trading with the French, we're going to sink your ships, we're going to board your ships, and any British citizen, we are going to impress them. And they would often impress Americans who had no connection to Britain. Impressing means just basically stealing you and forcing you to become part of the British Navy. They had all kinds of tricks up their sleeve. I don't know if that the rumor about this that kind of floats around, that like if you put even as much as a farthing or a halfpenny in your beer, that the recruitment officer would buy somebody a beer, and he would put and it was a cloudy beer, they put a coin in the bottom of it, and then that's essentially you took money from them, and that's a contract. I don't know if that's true. That's sort of the way people think of it, and they did get up to some tricky stuff just to kind of basically legal bullying or strong arming people into it. So anyway, they started commandeering ships, they started confiscating goods, or if they wanted to, the Americans wanted to do a trade with the West Indies, the French West Indies, the British ships would basically kind of bully the ship into a British harbor and basically make them sell the goods to them for a song. So the British were always very antagonistic towards the Americans in the early republic, and eventually it just came to blows, and America just made a lot of ill-advised attacks in what is today Canada. They basically burned the sort of trading post of York, which is now Toronto. Actually, there's a city called York that's just outside of Toronto, part of the Greater Toronto area, and they tried to muster up some forces to go invade Montreal to expand. Never really recognized the British claims in Canada. It was just completely disorganized. Nobody knew what the hell was going on. And the British kind of half-heartedly fought the war. I mean, if they had actually put their minds to it, they probably could have defeated the Americans. And indeed, they actually did burn down the White House. There wasn't much to the White House, but they can always claim that they burned down the White House. So anyway, he basically, after 2 terms, he's had enough. He passes the torch off to one of his best friends, James Monroe. So he's probably going to be the next president I read about. And so he spent the next, I don't know, 20 years writing to the president about giving advice, and writing to congressmen, giving advice on how to handle situations or what his view of the Constitution is. Obviously, because he wrote the Constitution, he wrote many essays about the Constitution. He was there in the room with all these brainiacs at the Constitutional Congress, and he was president. So this guy had wealth. He basically, any major post, he had served it. He's really quite a remarkable character, and he was an interesting fellow. And obviously, like I'm not going to go into it too far, but I think anybody who judges characters from this time period, especially slave-owning landowners, will obviously point to the fact that he did own slaves and not free them. Some of the slave-owning landowners did get, basically grant freedom to their slaves, or they get some kind of deal where eventually they would. Every single one of these, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, Washington, knew implicitly and wrote a lot about the evils of slavery. They knew it was wrong. Their religion prohibited it. They didn't make excuses for it. They just never got around to it. I think the impression that I get from other sources as well as this book is that getting the American project off the ground was the most important thing of all. What to do with the slaves once they had been freed, or if they ever been freed, or what that would look like, was not as pressing concern as national security. And they may have been right, they may have been wrong, and they're going to be judged for that forever. History, but we do have the United States still. There is no slavery, so they did add on 3 or 4 generations of slavery to American history. So that's always going to be a black mark on their reputation. But by and large, writing something that the ancestors of these slaves can point to and say, that's mine, a slave owner gave me that, is something. It causes a lot of cognitive dissonance in anybody who is a patriot or a fan of America from abroad. You're just going to have to live with that contradiction. And obviously not everything's black and white, but by and large he seems like a decent, I would say he's probably a more decent political theorist and sort of patriot and founding father. He did a decent job as a president, but maybe he could have staved off war, not invaded Canada, which just ended up being a complete waste of time and waste of money, and a lot of people died because of it. So anyway, that's about all. If you want more on James Madison the man, I don't think this is your book. If you're just interested in knowing what his political philosophy was, what was going on, his role in history, this is a good book for you to read. So I still think there was room in there to discuss more about his personal relationship, but obviously, that didn't end up being in the book. So that's about all. And I'll see you in another video. See ya.